Howdy, folks. Hope everyone is doing good this morning. I was working on a few things, but thought I would just put together a little office hours, sort of follow up to my last one. Got some questions that I thought were kind of interesting that have come across my desk, and figured I would just pop on, sort of give some thoughts on those, and then do a couple bits and bobs maybe at the end, and see where we go from there. So I will link to each question in the show notes, but if you're looking for it later. But for now, let me just jump on into the first question. So the first question I got was, this is from a David Elrod, and he wanted to know what is the best way to add a column requiring a default value to an existing table. And what I thought was kind of interesting about this question is we used to get this more, and we still do get it occasionally. And my hope is that, sometime in the near future, we won't get it at all. And let me kind of explain what I mean by all that. So the main issue, I think, where this is coming from is that when Postgres adds a column to a table, one of the things most people realize, like, it takes an exclusive lock on the table. So it blocks all reads and writes. And normally this is okay. I mean, it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's usually fine because it only needs to hold that lock for, a few milliseconds while it updates the system catalogs and, updates metadata about the table. And then once it has that done, so it's a couple of write operations, and bam, you're back in business. And so even on a very high traffic system, you can usually get this through without too much trouble, and without too much disruption. But it does, well, or at least it used to depend. Again, I'll get to this in a second. But the difference is that if you were just adding the column, that's fine. All the values in the column would end up being null. But if you required a default value, the way this used to work in Postgres was that Postgres would actually have to rewrite all the data in the table in order to populate that default value for any existing row. And so you can imagine on a large table, especially hundreds of gigs, terabyte level, like, that's a lot of data that has to get rewritten. And again, you're blocked from all reads and writes during that time. So that, it's bad. I have seen it be catastrophic. And actually, I mean, I've seen that specific issue, and that sort of failure pattern has been an issue that has caused people to say, like, well, we're going to give up on relational databases and we're going to go use, some kind of document store or something. Like, we'll figure out the schema later. We just want to be able to put in whatever columns we want and not have to deal with that kind of an issue. So now, the reason why I say, like, hopefully we won't see this for too much longer as a question is because, and I'm sort of speaking really strictly about Postgres, and I guess even community Postgres. I'm not entirely sure how other databases handle this particular case. I think some have the issue still with the locking and rewriting type of thing. And I would say if you're on some kind of, like, community fork or whatever, maybe it's different. But in any modern Postgres, and I say modern Postgres, which is to say that this behavior was changed in Postgres 11. So if you're running any active version of Postgres, like 11 to 16, you really shouldn't run into this. And I think a lot of people just don't realize that. And I know, yeah, there's plenty of people still out there running Postgres 10, Postgres 9.6. Like, yeah, I understand that. But if if you started in the business 5 years ago on Postgres 11, and you haven't upgraded since, like, you still, you'd be years into your work and shouldn't have run into this problem. So, but in any case, so the behavior that was changed was that Postgres still takes the exclusive lock, but what happens now is when it adds updates the system catalogs, is adding metadata about the table, one of the pieces that it adds is it takes that default value that you've passed in and stores that in the system catalog, so that if you select off of that table, you'll actually get that default value back, right? And it doesn't have to rewrite any of the data. It knows what is supposed to be the default value for any row that doesn't have it. And so that, you're back into the millisecond range of needing that exclusive lock on the table. And so that just, makes everything a lot better. And so that's really wonderful. And like I said, it's from Postgres 11 beyond. Now, as you insert and as you update, it will populate that column on disk and store that information. If there's some kind of table rewrite operation, right, there can be a number of ways that you will get that populated. But in any case, as far as the actual alter table needing an exclusive lock, only takes milliseconds now in order to make that work. And obviously, like, don't believe some rando on the internet. Like, make sure you test that. Especially, like I say, if you're on, like, some kind of fork of Postgres, or something like that, like, you might want to make sure that behavior has made it into whatever you're using. But by and large, like I think that this will go away. And these kinds of questions that we see, sometimes we see them, one, it takes a few years because people run old systems. Other times it's just people are scarred by the incidents they've had in the past, so they still kind of wonder. But, now I would say this shouldn't really be an issue. And if you run into it, seek public help, I guess, or another job or something, right? Because you might be on some super old system. So anyway, so that was question number one. Let me go on to number two. And this one, also kind of an interesting question, kind of depends on the interpretation. So this came from a Dominic Tripodi. He wanted to know, what are the advantages of an object relational database like Postgres versus a relational database like MySQL? And I'm going to kind of start by just looking at this from a different lens for just a second, which is to say that there are differences between those two from a theoretical standpoint. But I think it also does really depend on how you group your databases together. As an example, there are many folks who would say, if you look at like relational theory, that Postgres and MySQL aren't true relational databases, that they're actually SQL databases, because so much of their behavior and how they operate is based on the SQL standard. And that would, SQL Server, Oracle, whatever, any of the sort of major databases follow the SQL standard. And so people, there are some folks, I don't know that that's a large contingent, but they're sort of relational purists, as sometimes they get called, that would tell you like these are SQL databases, not relational databases. And I only mention that here just because I think, remember, these groupings can sometimes be a little bit arbitrary, and what you think is, something that maybe is a relational thing, maybe that's really a SQL thing, or vice versa, whatever. So back to the question at hand, though. So if you say object relational versus regular relational database, I would say there's some things you can pull out, in the theory side of it with regards to inheritance and whatnots. But I think what actually matters to most people is, so what is the practical application of that, and how has that made a difference for Postgres? And I'll start with sort of the idea that there are some sort of tools and things I think you can build on top of the object relational piece in Postgres, making use of the table inheritance with parent and child tables and whatnot. And we used to do like partitioning with that, right? Like that was the sort of underpinnings of the first partitioning implementations. Now, not quite so much, although you can still kind of see it there if you look under the hood a little bit, as to how partitioning is done. But I'd also say, like, I built solutions in the past that, really made use of table inheritance, like in the sense of table inheritance, where I had, a primary object and then child objects underneath it that stored different data, but all of them had, some sort of set of columns that was shared across all of these. So, and when a new entity showed up, like we made a new child table for that, and kind of built on top of that. There are folks that will tell you, like, don't ever do that, and I'm probably close to being one of those people. I thought those solutions were good at the time, and I think they were, given the capabilities we had. But I would also say, like, they were complex, right? Like, so you get this power and this sort of functionality, but it's not a simple system, and to sort of get your head around it can be difficult. It's difficult to program around because, other databases don't really support this paradigm. So that's a problem. And I can think of at least one or two projects where I had built something like that in the past. And, DBAs years later would come along and take over and be like, we're just going to rewrite that entire thing. And that's fine. Like, there's projects that I've had where, like, I built it one way. And there's one I built, we did nested set valuations for tree structure, and then we rebuilt that into using object in table inheritance within Postgres. And then I think it later got rewritten into something else. So, sometimes schema evolution is small, and sometimes it's a little more drastic. So that's cool. That's not super popular thing. So when I look at it and I say, well, what did Postgres get from the object relationship? What's the heritage of Postgres, and why did that matter? And I think what it did is it set a tone very early on for extensibility, whether it was, creating your own data types, creating functions and operators on those data types, and the idea of different indexing methods that you might have, and kind of all that stuff. That, if you look at how Postgres has implemented that, it's built kind of on the back of the object relational piece. And that's really been the legacy of that object relational side within Postgres. And again, like you don't have to have the object relational piece to do that in a database. If you look at something like MySQL and you would say, well, their table plugin architecture was there, years before. I mean, Postgres now has different access methods, and people are kind of building some stuff around there, but it's not, super popular. There's not a lot of sort of active development going on there, active solutions being built. Whereas if you were to go back, I don't know, 10 or maybe 15 years ago, at the kind of height of MySQL popularity, you had people building entire companies around storage plugins for MySQL. So you can definitely do that without the object relational piece. Whether it's as clean as Postgres does it or whatnot, like I don't know. That's kind of, I guess, for others can decide on that. From my point of view, at least, I just think that that was the thing that sort of, again, it set the tone for Postgres, that we were going to be extensible. We were going to have, features like that and be able to build systems on top of it using that. So that's why I think the object relational piece mattered to Postgres, even though, again, like SQL Server, I think you can do like 3 different storage types, because you can do the normal is like index oriented tables. But you can store, I think, like basic heap tables, much like Postgres with secondary indexes and whatnot. And I think they do a columnar storage format as well within the table. So, I mean, you can implement some of these features without having the object relational piece. I just think that in Postgres, these pieces fit together so nicely because of that historical object relational implementation. So that's probably how I would answer that, and again, it might kind of depends on how you want to split some of these lines of which piece falls into which bucket. So, okay, so third question. And all right, yeah, so this one also kind of how do you interpret this question? So the question came from a Kieran Venna and wanted to know, how does Postgres make money? And this one, I don't know his relationship with Postgres and how he's gotten into it, but I think for many people, even people that have worked with a lot of open source, they tend to think of, especially on the database side, because most database projects fall into this, they tend to think of an open source project often is the open source arm of a commercial company. And so if you go to like postgresql.org and you see like, hey, there's software and you can download, and there's different like chats and email lists and all this stuff, but if you're looking for like, where is the commercial thing, like where do I get the license, or how do I buy the service, you don't see any of that. So then you're like, well, I don't understand how these people are making money. And so I'm going to divide this kind of into 2 buckets, and each of these buckets could definitely be further subdivided, but for the sake of keeping the answer at least somewhat simple, the first I'm going to say is like, so there's Postgres itself is a community organization, right? It's not like a real company in that sense. It is more of a commons of code that people have contributed to and make use of. And so then there are people who are taking that code and then commercializing it in multiple ways. And so for an example, like the obvious ones, hopefully obvious, I would say would be like the big cloud providers, oddly later to the game than some of these other folks, but they're doing hosted Postgres, managed Postgres, depending on how you want to clarify that. But things like Azure and RDS and having that sort of managed Postgres for you and putting that piece in there. So they're commercializing Postgres that way. Now then you also have companies like Crunchy Data or Instacluster that will help you run your own Postgres, and they also provide sort of more hands-on support if you need it, right? If you need consulting and more of a sort of deep dive hands-on help with the support of your Postgres, or need an environment that's not in the cloud, even just that kind of thing. They'll do it in the cloud, but also you can do it like on-prem, depending on the specifics of what you need. So they give you a little more flexibility, a little more hands-on love and TLC and all that good stuff from companies like that. Of course, you have independent Postgres contractors and folks like I do occasional consulting for people, and there's other folks out there who are doing that kind of work. And then, of course, you have people who are building on top or around or within the Postgres ecosystem, right? So maybe it's not Postgres specifically, but 2 good examples would be somebody like Redgate. They make database backup software and other sort of DevOps tooling around databases, and they now support Postgres. So they're on some level commercializing within the Postgres ecosystem. Or you can look at somebody like PG Edge, which is a new startup. They have a active, distributed, multi-active, super magic replication Postgres. So you can kind of do, distributed writes across the Postgres cluster. So those folks are out there as well. They're building tooling on top of Postgres. So there are plenty of people who are making money on Postgres. Don't kid yourself for a second. Like, all of those people are making money off of Postgres, and using it to help make money, and giving back. Hopefully, some more than others, I'm sure, but yeah, we'll leave that aside for the moment. But there's definitely people making money on Postgres. That's not even a question. Not to mention, DBAs or DBREs, or even devs that are like big into Postgres. And you have folks like that who are building things. And I give another example, which kind of will lean into the sort of second bucket. So you'd have a company like Bloomberg. They use a lot of Postgres under the hood in order to build the services and whatnot that they do. So they're like news, information, financial services. Financial news and information is the type of thing that Bloomberg is into. And I mentioned them just as a topical answer. There's lots of companies, like, most companies are building on top of Postgres. I don't know if it's most companies, but certainly thousands and thousands of companies use Postgres at the core, or in other parts of their infrastructure. Certainly, I've worked at a bunch of these companies like Etsy and DoorDash and whatever, that have used Postgres. But if you think about like somebody from Bloomberg, so they're using Postgres to commercialize a totally different thing, and Postgres is like a component of their technology stack. And where I say this leans into the second bucket is they recently made a donation, so they have a FOSS contributor fund where they donate back to open source projects that either they have created or that they make use of, in order to support those open source projects. And so when they donate into the second bucket, which are the Postgres nonprofit organizations. And there are a number of these organizations that are around. As a disclosure, I work as the liaison for the Postgres project with Software in the Public Interest, which is an umbrella organization that helps other open source projects with like legal and sort of business paperwork type matters, financial matters as well. And probably the one that most people know, Debian project, is tied into SPI, and Postgres has a piece there. But we have other nonprofits as well. Depending on what region of the world you live in, you may have interacted with those other nonprofits as well. And so those nonprofits, again, they're nonprofits, so they're not necessarily trying to make profit, but they do have money that comes in through different ways. Primarily, they tend to be donation and sort of contribution funded. Some have some other things, like some of them you can buy like a membership into the nonprofit and be a member of it, and so then they can make a little revenue that way as well, and then that money gets funneled back. In the Postgres world, primarily it goes towards sort of advocacy and community support things. With SPI, we do a piece of that. Like we work with Google Summer of Code to help facilitate that, and we've occasionally given money out for mentees to be able to go to like the Google Summer of Code Summit that they do, if they can't get the travel costs covered. But we also will buy like infrastructure. So we recently got like 2 OSX boxes to help with sort of build farm testing, that type of thing, for the hackers. There's a bunch of that kind of infrastructure. There's PostgreSQL.org and the website and mailing list and infrastructure that runs that. And some of that is donated and some of that's been purchased by nonprofits. And then there's other things like testing and whatnot that go on, and a lot of that is done in the cloud, but occasionally there'll be hardware that gets purchased for those needs as well. So there's the nonprofit side. You could think of that as Postgres making money, but again, it's not like that it owns the code or something like that. You can't sell a license from the nonprofits or anything like that. So it's not that type of relationship, for better or worse. But if you say, like, how does Postgres make money, I think I would mention that side as well. So hopefully that answers the question. Hopefully that gives you a good picture of how that all works. And it does it for you. So, all right, 3 questions real quick, in and out. Let me mention a few bits and bobs here at the end about schedule. I'm actually going to be out on the road quite a bit next month. I will be speaking at PGConf New York, and I'm doing a talk there called Think Like a Postgres, which is all about how Postgres interprets your SQL questions and what it has to do to go about getting answers and giving them back to you. And the idea is for you to understand how that process works so that you can think like Postgres thinks and better understand what it's going to do when you are querying a database and need to do like performance troubleshooting or query design or those types of things. This is sort of the first foundational piece of that. And I'll be doing that talk in New York City. I'm also going to be doing a couple of booths later in the month, one at All Things Open, which is in Raleigh, North Carolina. That is October 15th through the 17th, and it'll be a US Postgres community booth. Speaking of nonprofits, that's run through the US Postgres nonprofit. And it'll be myself and a few other folks that'll be there, and there are several Postgres talks, and that's not a Postgres conference. Like PGConf New York is a dedicated Postgres conference. All Things Open, I think it's actually the largest open source conference on the East Coast, but it is about all things open source from, Fortune 500, IBM, Red Hat is there in force because they're based primarily out of Raleigh. And but so you've got that size of it. You've got Postgres, sort of commons oriented open source project versus product. You've got independent open source developers. So, all kinds of open source goes on there. If you want to see how big and wide the ecosystem is around open source, like that is a great conference to go to. So that should be a lot of fun. And I will also be at FOSS4G, which is the free and open source for geospatial conference, the North America edition, which is October 23rd through the 25th. Again, doing a US community booth. I'm super happy for two reasons. One, because the conference is in my old stomping grounds of Baltimore, so you can bet I'll be doing mad pit beef and crab cakes while I'm in town, and hopefully seeing a bunch of folks. But also, this is actually the first time I'll be going to FOSS4G. I've certainly talked with a whole bunch of folks in the PostGIS geospatial world over the years running Postgres, but I've not actually been to the conference, so I will hopefully get to meet a whole bunch more new people there and talk with them. And just sort of, those people, I mean, they're so smart. Like, I talk to them and I'm also like, dude, can melt my brain on some of the stuff that they do. When you see how they're actually making use of some of the stuff within PostGIS and doing sort of spatial stuff and how they solve problems that you're like, that doesn't even sound like a, map thing. Like that's, mapping time over a network or something. Like it's kind of wild. So looking forward to that for sure. So hopefully I will catch you out on the road if you are in the area. Please stop by a booth, and happy to answer questions and whatnot. Otherwise, I will probably try to pop out at least one more of these before I head out on the road. If you have questions, feel free to send them to me or drop them in the comments. I'm supposed to also say, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hopefully you find this useful. Otherwise, I will talk to you next time. Thank you so much.